It is late in the spring of 1945, a time when the landscape of war has been irrevocably altered. The distant rumble of artillery has quieted, replaced by an eerie stillness that stretches across the hills of rural Germany. Inside a POW camp, a group of German nurses stands in the shadows of the barracks, their faces weary, their uniforms stained with the weight of months spent under captivity. The air is cool but heavy with unspoken words. The nurses, once tasked with healing the wounds of their own soldiers, now find themselves on the other side of the battlefield, prisoners of the enemy. Then, as if from nowhere, the unexpected happens. American officers wearing the marks of victory on their faces approach the camp. They announce without fanfare or force that the German nurses will be allowed to attend church services. There is no argument, no hesitation. It is a simple, almost surreal offer of mercy amid the ravages of war. The nurses, stunned and uncertain, exchange glances. These women, accustomed to the chaos of war, are now being presented with a moment of peace, a brief, fragile interlude in the brutality that has defined their lives for so long. For a few hours, they are not prisoners or victors, but simply human beings searching for solace in a war-torn world. The year 1945 stood as the final chapter in the relentless and devastating saga of World War II. The Allied forces, having pushed the Axis back on all fronts, were now within striking distance of Berlin. For the German military, the situation was dire. The Eastern Front had crumbled under the weight of the Soviet onslaught, and the Western Front was fast becoming a battlefield, littered with the wreckage of retreating German forces. The once mighty Nazi war machine was now a fractured and broken shadow of its former self. By May of 1945, Germany had surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, marking the end of Hitler's regime and the collapse of the Third Reich. Yet this surrender came at a high human cost. The war had left Europe in ruins, cities bombed into oblivion, and millions of lives lost. The fate of those left behind, soldiers, civilians, and women in wartime roles, hung in a delicate balance. Among these were the thousands of German women who had served as nurses during the war. Their role had been crucial on both the front lines and in the rear, as they treated the wounded, soothed the dying, and performed vital medical care under unimaginable conditions. These women, many of them barely in their 20s, had seen the horrors of war firsthand. They had often been thrust into dire situations where the line between enemy and ally blurred into a hazy moral landscape. As the war wound down, the fate of these nurses was uncertain. Some had been captured by the advancing Soviet forces, while others found themselves in the custody of the Americans. The treatment of prisoners of war, POWs, in the aftermath of the conflict varied widely, depending on which power held them. While the Soviets were infamous for their brutal treatment of POWs, the American approach was more nuanced, though still grounded in the harsh realities of war. The Americans, having fought hard and suffered greatly, were now tasked with the monumental job of rebuilding a shattered Europe. Amid the ruins, the treatment of German POWs was both a matter of policy and of morality. While the Americans were not without their own prejudices, especially toward former Nazi soldiers, their approach to prisoners was more rooted in the idea of rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. As the prisoners shuffled through the makeshift camps that dotted the landscape of post-war Europe, life was grim. They were housed in cramped barracks with minimal provisions and were put to work in the effort to clear debris, rebuild infrastructure, and assist in the recovery of war-torn towns. For many German nurses, the work they now performed was the same as it had been in their past life, to care for the wounded. However, the irony was not lost on them. They were now tasked with caring for soldiers from the very army that had invaded their homeland. In the midst of this uneasy existence, the simple act of mercy, the decision to allow them to attend a church service, became a pivotal moment. For the nurses, who had long been part of a regime that had justified countless atrocities in the name of war, the offer was unexpected. It was a rare instance where their captors, despite their victories, chose to extend an olive branch instead of maintaining a hardened stance. For the Americans, it was an act of grace in the aftermath of a bitter and destructive conflict. World War II dramatically altered the roles of women across the globe, particularly in nations that had been embroiled in the conflict. In Germany, the war brought women to the forefront of various critical roles. many of which were previously considered exclusively male domains. The need for manpower, combined with the rising demands of total war, created a space for women in the medical, industrial, and military sectors. One of the most significant roles women occupied during the war was as nurses. The German Red Cross and other medical organizations enlisted women to serve as nurses, both on the front lines and within hospitals throughout occupied Europe. These women, many of them volunteers, were often no more than 20 years old, yet they carried the immense responsibility of tending to the wounded, administering aid under fire, and sometimes even delivering vital medical care in battlefield conditions. For these nurses, the experience of war was far different from the idealized images of duty and service portrayed by the state. They worked in the chaos of battlefield hospitals, performing surgeries under extreme pressure and often without adequate supplies. The emotional toll was heavy. They treated both German soldiers and enemy combatants alike, as the humanitarian aspect of their profession transcended national borders. Many of these women had to reconcile the horrors of war with their commitment to healing, and the lines between right and wrong often blurred. They witnessed firsthand the brutality of the war machine, yet they remained dedicated to their calling. By 1945, as the war began to wind down and Germany's defeat became inevitable, these nurses found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. With the collapse of Nazi Germany, thousands of German nurses were taken as prisoners of war by the Allies. They were moved into POW camps, where their daily lives would no longer be defined by medical duties, but by the uncertainty of their future. The experience of being a prisoner was a far cry from the role they had played in the German medical system. No longer were they in charge of healing others, but now, they themselves became subjects of wartime control. They were held in cramped makeshift camps far from their homes and families, subject to the same hardships as the soldiers who had fought against them. Yet, for many of the nurses, the experience of captivity was paradoxically less brutal than that of the soldiers. They were not subjected to forced labor to the same extent, nor did they face the same risk of execution that the former soldiers did. However, their captivity was no less uncertain. Though their situation was grim, the German nurses in these camps were not forgotten by their captors. The American officers and soldiers tasked with managing the POWs were faced with the decision of how to handle their prisoners. In the immediate aftermath of such a devastating conflict, the Americans had a choice. They could exact harsh retribution for the damage Germany had caused, or they could try to bring some measure of humanity back to a situation that had been marred by cruelty on all sides. For many American officers, the decision to treat prisoners with a modicum of respect was rooted in a broader moral philosophy, influenced by the ideals of democracy and freedom that had driven their involvement in the war. This tension between the desire for justice and the need for humanity was at the core of many decisions that would shape the post-war period. When the order was given to allow German nurses to attend church services in the camp, it was not just a matter of charity. It was a decision that transcended mere policy. It was an act that reflected the profound psychological and moral shift that was occurring within the American forces. After years of brutal combat and suffering, this small yet powerful act of mercy became a symbol of the fragility of peace and the complexity of wartime morality. For the German nurses, war had been an unrelenting trial of strength, sacrifice, and survival. These women were often thrust into a world far removed from the one they had imagined when they first enlisted. Many had joined the medical corps with idealistic visions of helping their country, of making a difference. But by the end of the war, the reality was far darker. They had treated the wounds of soldiers on the front lines, aided the victims of bombings, and faced the horrors of mass casualties. The ethical dilemmas they confronted were almost unbearable, as they sometimes had to choose between saving one life over another, depending on the severity of the injuries. Now, in captivity, these same nurses faced a new set of emotional burdens. The initial shock of being captured gave way to a deeper, more profound psychological toll. They were caught in a no-man's land of war, neither the victors nor the vanquished. Their comrades were either dead or in hiding, their families scattered or lost. Many of these women had witnessed the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime and had to reconcile their service to an institution that had caused so much suffering. Yet in the grim conditions of the POW camp, a strange shift began to occur. Stripped of the ideologies that had once defined them, many nurses started to view the enemy differently. The Americans, though still seen as adversaries, were no longer the faceless enemy they had been taught to despise. The decision to allow them to attend church services, a simple gesture of mercy, was not just a reprieve from the harshness of captivity. It was a moment of reflection, an opportunity to reconnect with a sense of humanity they had lost amidst the carnage of war. For many of the nurses, this small act of kindness began to chip away at the walls they had built around their emotions. The church services were more than just religious gatherings. They became a space where the nurses could reclaim a sense of their former selves. As they stood together in a foreign land singing hymns and praying for peace, they were reminded of the world they had known before the war, a world that now seemed like a distant memory. From a tactical perspective, the management of prisoners of war was a challenge that the Allied forces took very seriously. The sheer number of German POWs, estimated at around 3 million at the war's end, presented logistical challenges that stretched the resources of the American military. The prisoners were housed in makeshift camps throughout Germany and Austria, and their care was overseen by military personnel who had been trained not just in combat, but in the fundamentals of managing large groups of prisoners. For American officers, the handling of prisoners was not just a matter of containment, but one of control. As the victors in a brutal war, they had the power to enforce strict discipline, yet there was a growing understanding that the post-war period would require a different approach. The treatment of prisoners was not simply about retribution, but also about shaping the future of Europe and ensuring that the ghosts of Nazi ideology did not return. The decision to allow the German nurses to attend church services was not just a spontaneous act of goodwill. It was a carefully considered move that took into account both the psychological state of the prisoners and the strategic value of maintaining order in the camps. American officers understood that the morale of the POWs was crucial to preventing unrest. In a camp already filled with tension, allowing prisoners to attend religious services was seen as a way to give them a sense of normalcy, to remind them that despite their captivity, they were still human beings worthy of dignity. In this context, the church service became more than just an opportunity for the nurses to reflect. It was a strategic decision designed to keep the camp stable and prevent the rise of resistance or discontent. By offering this act of mercy, the American officers demonstrated a level of understanding that transcended the typical view of wartime enemies. They knew that the healing process, both for the prisoners and for the larger world, would require more than just physical care. It would require compassion. The decision to allow the German nurses to attend church services was, at its core, a reflection of leadership philosophy in the post-war era. American military leaders, many of whom had spent years engaged in the brutal fighting across Europe, understood that the war had left deep scars on both sides. While they were tasked with the difficult job of administering justice, they also knew that the recovery of Europe, both physically and psychologically, required a different kind of leadership. In the chaos of war, leadership could often be defined by force. The chain of command in military camps, particularly POW camps, was rigid, and discipline was often maintained through fear. However, the American officers in charge of the German nurses were faced with a unique situation. These nurses were not soldiers. They were women who had, for all intents and purposes, been caught in the gears of a war they had not started. Many American officers, recognizing the gravity of the moment, chose to extend a measure of grace. The church service was a powerful symbol of this shift. By allowing the nurses to attend, the officers made a statement that went beyond military protocol. It reflected a belief in the value of mercy and in the possibility of reconciliation, even in the darkest days of post-war Europe. This act of compassion was not just a rare moment of humanity in a conflict defined by brutality. It was a calculated move that aimed to shape the future of European relations and to set a tone of forgiveness and healing. In the months that followed the end of the war, the choice was not universally accepted, nor was it easy to make. Many soldiers and officers still reeling from the horrors of the war might have viewed such an act as a betrayal of the lives lost during the conflict. But for others, the decision was emblematic of the broader vision they had for Europe's future. The church service was a space for the nurses to reclaim a sense of normalcy and dignity, and it provided a glimmer of hope in a time when hope was in short supply. From the perspective of the German nurses, their captivity was a complex emotional and psychological experience. They were caught between two conflicting realities. They had been part of the Nazi medical establishment, which had supported an ideology of conquest and violence. Yet now, as prisoners, they found themselves in the strange position of being enemies of the very forces they had once viewed as their adversaries. Their service in the German Medical Corps had been rooted in a complex set of motivations, from patriotism to a deep sense of duty. Yet, the brutality of the war, coupled with the growing realization of the horrors perpetrated by the Nazi regime, left many of them questioning the righteousness of the cause they had served. When they first encountered the American soldiers, many of the nurses likely viewed them with a mixture of fear, confusion, and resentment. These were the same soldiers who had bombed their cities, killed their comrades, and brought the war to their doorstep. But as the weeks passed, the stark reality of captivity set in. The nurses, like the American soldiers, were simply trying to survive in a world that had been shattered by war. The uniform they wore no longer represented the power of the Third Reich. Instead, it was a symbol of their fall from grace and the collapse of everything they had once known. When the announcement came that they would be allowed to attend church services, the German nurses were taken aback. The idea of mercy, especially in the face of such devastation, was a hard concept to grasp. It was not simply that the Americans were offering them a chance to practice their faith. It was that they were treating them as human beings, capable of redemption. For many of these women, it was an act they had never anticipated. To be granted such an opportunity, however small, was a stark reminder of the humanity that still existed on both sides of the conflict. As they stood in the pews of the church, the American soldiers watching over them, it was impossible for the nurses not to reflect on the nature of the enemy. The line between victor and vanquished blurred in the soft light of the service. The bitterness they had carried with them began to dissipate, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement of the decency of those who had defeated them. The church service allowed them to see beyond the uniform, beyond the battlefield. For a brief moment, they were no longer enemies. They were simply two groups of people caught in the same war, seeking some kind of solace in a world that had been torn apart. The decision to allow the German nurses to attend church services was a moral act that stands out in the midst of the brutality of World War II. It was a rare example of compassion in a time when mercy was often forgotten, replaced by the harsh logic of retribution. The world had witnessed horrors on an unprecedented scale during the conflict, and the desire for revenge was a natural impulse for many of those who had suffered. Yet the Americans who made this decision chose to go against the grain, offering the German nurses a moment of peace, a fleeting experience of normalcy amidst their captivity. For the nurses, the invitation to the church service was not merely about the opportunity to pray or to reflect on their own spiritual beliefs. It was an acknowledgement of their humanity. In a war where entire populations had been reduced to mere statistics, where the suffering of civilians and soldiers alike had been ignored in the name of military strategy, this simple act of kindness became something profound. It was a moment of grace that transcended the immediate concerns of the war, offering the nurses a glimpse of the world they had once known, one where kindness and mercy had not been completely eradicated. But there was also a deeper moral complexity at play. How did the nurses, many of whom had been part of a regime that had committed unforgivable crimes, reconcile the mercy offered by their captors with the atrocities they had been complicit in? This was not a question that could be answered easily, and for many the service was a time of inner conflict. Could they accept the kindness extended to them by those they had once considered their enemies? Were they deserving of such mercy, given their association with the Nazi regime? In the quiet moments of prayer, some of the nurses likely grappled with these questions. For others, the act of attending the service was an opportunity for personal redemption, a chance to seek peace for themselves in a world that had lost its sense of morality. The church service in this light became not just an act of mercy from the Americans, but an act of healing for the nurses themselves. It allowed them to confront their past, their complicity in the war that had consumed their lives. It was, in a sense, a moment where they could reclaim a small piece of their humanity. Wartime medicine, particularly in POW camps, presented a unique set of challenges. The field of medicine during World War II was still in its infancy compared to today's standards. Medical personnel often operated in makeshift conditions, using rudimentary tools and working under extreme pressure. The role of the nurses in these settings was critical, as they were the ones who managed the care of the wounded, administered treatments, and performed triage under horrific conditions. In the POW camps, medical resources were scarce, and the nurses found themselves using the same methods of care they had been trained in back home, but with fewer supplies and far greater urgency. Many of the nurses, now prisoners themselves, were tasked with tending to the wounded from both sides. While they no longer wore the uniform of the Nazi regime, their knowledge and skills remained invaluable. They found themselves once again in the uncomfortable position of healing soldiers who had fought against them. The presence of the nurses in these camps also had a psychological effect on the prisoners. For many of the American soldiers, seeing a German nurse, once part of the enemy forces, now tending to their wounds, was a sobering reminder of the complexity of war. It was a moment where the stark divisions of the battlefield, victor and vanquished, began to blur. Yet it was also a moment where the humanity of the individuals involved came into sharper focus. The act of healing, no matter which side one was on, had the power to transcend national allegiances and bring the prisoners together in a shared experience of vulnerability. It is a quiet moment in a war-torn world, a brief pause in the relentless march of history. The day is neither extraordinary nor significant in the grand scope of the war. It is simply another day in the chaos of a collapsing Germany, the remnants of the Third Reich scattered across the fields and streets. Yet this day will be remembered not for its battles or its losses, but for the unexpected grace shown in the midst of great suffering. American officers, fresh from the victory that had come at a heavy cost, found themselves in charge of thousands of German POWs, including nurses who had once served their own wounded soldiers on distant battlefields. These prisoners, held in makeshift camps, had been subjected to the harsh realities of war. Their lives, once defined by purpose and duty, were now reduced to survival. Survival amidst the uncertain and often grim environment of captivity. The harshness of war and of defeat had stripped away much of their dignity. They were no longer the caregivers, but the cared for. The moment came as an unlikely offering, a decision made in the quiet corridors of the POW camp. An American officer, perhaps moved by the obvious emotional toll of the nurses, perhaps sensing the growing tension between the captors and the captured, made the call. The German nurses were to be allowed to attend church services. There was no military strategy behind the decision. It was not calculated for any strategic advantage. It was, in essence, an act of humanity, an opportunity for these women to reconnect with their spiritual and moral centers in a time of utter despair. The announcement came with no fanfare. The nurses, initially stunned by the offer, were uncertain of how to respond. It was an unspoken truth that the animosity between captor and captive had been thickened by years of brutal combat. And now, as the war was winding down, the ghosts of the conflict were not so easily exorcised. The nurses had been a part of the Nazi Medical Corps, a group tied inextricably to a regime that had perpetrated untold horrors. How could they, now prisoners, accept such an act of kindness from those they had once viewed as the enemy? But the tension in the air was palpable, and as the nurses slowly filed out of their barracks, walking cautiously toward the church, they found themselves caught in an unexpected moment of grace. The sky was overcast, the air cool but still, and as they entered the church, a profound silence fell over them. The American soldiers standing at attention allowed the nurses to pass, their faces betraying little emotion. This was not a moment for triumph or bitterness. It was simply a moment for reflection. The nurses, for the first time in months, were free to gather their thoughts in peace. There were no commands to follow, no wounds to tend to, no suffering to ease. The hymns echoed through the small chapel, their voices trembling as they sang songs of redemption and hope. It was not just a religious experience. It was an emotional release. The walls of the prison, if only for a moment, seemed to melt away. For those brief hours, they were no longer prisoners of war, but people seeking solace in the wreckage of a world they had once known. As the service drew to a close, The nurses stood in quiet reverence, their minds heavy with the weight of their experiences. They had been a part of something much larger than themselves, a war that had consumed millions of lives. And yet, in this moment, the world outside the church walls seemed to fade into the background. For the first time in years, they were given the space to reflect, to pray, and perhaps most importantly, to grieve for what had been lost. The impact of this act of mercy was profound, reverberating deep within the hearts of the German nurses. Many of them had seen the brutality of the Nazi regime up close. Some had even been complicit in it. The offer of church services was not just a gesture of peace between captor and captive. It was an invitation for personal reconciliation. It gave them the opportunity to confront their own guilt and shame, to process the emotional scars left by the war, and perhaps even to seek forgiveness not from their captors, but from themselves. The nurses left the church in silence, their minds still processing what had just transpired. They had entered as prisoners of war, but they left with a sense of dignity they had not known since their capture. The small act of mercy had given them a new perspective on their situation. It was not just about survival. It was about understanding the humanity of both sides. It was about seeing the American soldiers, not as the enemy, but as fellow human beings, capable of compassion and mercy, even in the wake of all the destruction they had witnessed. This moment, so fleeting yet so powerful, marked a turning point for many of the nurses. In the aftermath of the war, as they were released and returned to a Germany in ruins, they carried with them the memory of that church service, a reminder that even in the darkest times, moments of humanity could still prevail. As the war ended and the nurses were slowly repatriated, the experience in that church lingered with them, a rare glimmer of kindness amid the horrors of conflict. The decision to allow them to attend the service was more than just an act of grace. It was a moment that reshaped their understanding of the enemy, of the war, and of their own place in a world that was beginning to rebuild itself. The conclusion of World War II marked the beginning of a new chapter for Europe, one defined by the painstaking process of rebuilding both physically and emotionally. For the German nurses who had spent months, even years, in captivity, the end of the war was not just a shift in political dynamics. It was a personal reckoning. They had been on the front lines of war, serving a regime that had inflicted unimaginable suffering across the continent. Now, as prisoners of war, they found themselves trying to piece together the fragments of their former lives while grappling with the trauma they had endured. The emotional aftermath of their captivity was complicated. The act of mercy shown to them by the Americans, the church service, was one that lingered long after their return to civilian life. Many of the nurses had lost their sense of purpose as caregivers, having been displaced from their roles and stripped of their uniforms. In captivity, they were not just prisoners. They were reminders of a regime that had brought devastation to Europe. Some of the nurses struggled with guilt, wondering if they could ever atone for their past, despite the fact that they had been complicit in the medical system of Nazi Germany, rather than in the atrocities themselves. As the nurses were repatriated to Germany, the country was in ruins. The cities they once knew were reduced to rubble, and the people who survived were deeply scarred by the war. Many of the nurses returned to families that had been torn apart, and the process of reintegration into society was far from easy. They were not only trying to rebuild their own lives, but to find their place in a society that was trying to come to terms with its own complicity in the war. The church service, though a brief moment of grace, was one of the few experiences they could cling to as a symbol of humanity amidst the ashes of war. For some, the memory of that moment in the church allowed them to rebuild a sense of hope. It was a reminder that mercy, even in the context of war, was possible. For others, the experience was a bitter reminder of the damage done to their homeland and the emotional toll it had taken. There was no clear answer for how these women reconciled their past with their present. The answers were as varied as the women themselves, but the act of kindness extended by the American soldiers became, for many of them, a pivotal moment in the post-war years. It was a point of reflection, a chance to begin the painful work of forgiveness, not only of others, but of themselves. The decision to allow German nurses to attend church services was not a turning point only for the nurses themselves. It had broader implications for how the Allies would treat their former enemies in the aftermath of the war. The policy of dealing with prisoners of war was evolving, and many of the decisions made in the aftermath of 1945 set the stage for the post-war relationship between Germany and the rest of Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a strong desire among the Allies to punish Germany for its role in the conflict. The Nuremberg trials would be held to prosecute the major war criminals, and the world would grapple with the moral responsibility of the Nazi leadership. Yet for the millions of ordinary Germans, soldiers, civilians, and medical personnel, the road to reconciliation would be much more complex. The American decision to offer mercy to the nurses reflected a more nuanced approach, one that recognized the need for healing, not just retribution. This moment of mercy extended to the German nurses was reflective of the broader American approach to the treatment of POWs. While there were certainly harsh conditions in some camps, the American military sought to differentiate between the Nazi regime and the individual soldiers and civilians who had been swept up in its machine. The policy of rehabilitation, rather than complete retribution, was part of a larger strategy to rebuild a shattered Europe and to avoid the kind of bitter, vengeful atmosphere that could lead to further conflict. In the years that followed, this shift in treatment would be evident in the way that the American occupation forces handled their relationship with the German populace. The emphasis on mercy, on understanding the complexities of war and the human experience, would eventually shape the way the Allies interacted with Germany in the early years of the Cold War. Though the scars of war were deep, the foundations of a new, more cooperative relationship began to take shape, in part due to acts of mercy like the church service granted to the nurses. This act was a small but significant example of how the end of the war was not just about military victory, it was about reconciliation. The healing process would be slow and painful, but moments like these helped to lay the groundwork for a more compassionate approach to the rebuilding of Europe. The American officers who made this decision understood that true victory was not simply about defeating the enemy, it was about restoring a sense of humanity in a world that had lost it. In the aftermath of World War II, the human cost of the conflict was impossible to ignore. The devastation was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and moral. Entire generations had been shaped by the war, and the scars left behind were deep and complex. The experience of the German nurses as both prisoners and caregivers underscores the difficulty of reconciling personal identity with the brutal realities of war. The small, seemingly insignificant act of allowing them to attend a church service was not merely an anomaly. It was a symbol of something larger, a gesture of grace that transcended the atrocities of the conflict. The church service represented more than just a brief respite from the suffering of captivity. It was a moment where the harshness of war was suspended, and in its place something pure and human emerged. For those German nurses, it was a rare opportunity to reconnect with their faith, their dignity, and their own sense of humanity. And for the American soldiers who stood by, allowing them that space, it was a recognition that mercy and compassion, even in the darkest of times, held the power to heal. This moment serves as a reminder that the true measure of victory is not always found in military strategy or in the destruction of an enemy. Sometimes it is found in the quiet, compassionate decisions made by individuals in the aftermath of war, decisions that seek to restore the humanity lost in conflict. In a world scarred by the brutality of war, the simple act of allowing a group of women to attend church services was a testament to the possibility of healing. It was an acknowledgement that even in the worst of circumstances, moments of peace and grace could still be found. As the world moved into the post-war era, these small acts of mercy laid the groundwork for the rebuilding of relationships, the reconciliation of former enemies, and the slow process of restoring trust in a fractured Europe. The memory of that church service for the German nurses and the American soldiers alike would endure as a poignant reminder that, even in the most harrowing chapters of history, humanity can still find a way to shine through.